감사합니다. And 안녕하세요. 반갑습니다 to all of you joining us this evening in the United States and over there during the day in Korea. As you may also know, Clayton Christensen had a deep connection to Korea. He did his missionary work in Korea several decades ago, and it left a profound mark on him, even after he had a stroke that harmed his ability to speak and read and things of that nature. Before his recent passing, he could still communicate with my wife, who's Korean, in Korean, and it held a very strong place in his heart. And I, of course, got to know Lee Joo-ho when I came to Korea on my Eisenhower Fellowship, and my wife and I lived there for some time studying the education system, so it holds a deep place in our hearts, and appreciate you having me join you today. What I thought I would do is first talk about what is disruptive innovation more generally, and then focus on why does it matter in higher education, and what are various examples. The theory of disruptive innovation has become a very popular theory, very widely known, but it's also deeply misunderstood and misapplied. And when Professor Christensen came up with the theory, he meant something very specific by it. And so I thought I would start my conversation there with setting what is disruptive innovation and what is it not. Disruptive innovation is often confused as being the same as some sort of breakthrough innovation or giant leap forward. But in fact, disruptive innovations are those that take sectors that are characterized by things that are complicated, deeply inaccessible, deeply centralized, hard to use, and makes them far more affordable, convenient, accessible, and simple. The easy way to portray what this looks like is to imagine that there's a series of concentric circles. And what I want you to do is imagine that that innermost circle represents those people who have the most expertise or wealth in any given field. And that as you go out the successive circles, it represents people who have comparatively less money or less expertise. And what we see in most industries is that they get their start inside that innermost circle with products and services that are very expensive and very complicated and very inaccessible or centralized, and therefore very few people can use them. And most of us exist on these outer circles as non-consumers. And it's the process of disruptive innovation that decentralizes that world over time and allows many, many more of us to become able to access more affordable products and services. So if you looked at computing, for example, before the advent of computers, we all, when we wanted to do computations or calculations, would take out a slide rule and do our computations and calculations out in this outermost circle. But then it was the advent of the mainframe computer in the 1940s and 50s that really created the computing industry. And these machines were so expensive, they cost roughly $2 million to buy a mainframe computer. They were large, they would fill entire rooms, and they required deep expertise to be able to use them, such that the majority of us existed in these outer circles as what we call non-consumers, literally unable to access, afford, or use the early computing machines. And then the process of disruptive innovation started to decentralize that world over time. First, there were the mini computers, still large machines that cost $250,000 and very few people could still access or use them. But then the big disruptive innovation was in the form of the personal computer in the late 1970s and early 1980s. The first personal computers were primitive. They actually weren't all that great, which is another hallmark of disruptive innovation, which is that the innovations, as opposed to being some sort of breakthrough or giant leap forward, they actually are very primitive. They're not nearly as good as judged by the historical measures of performance on which we've thought about these services. And as a result, they literally can't start inside those inner circles. And instead, they start among non-consumers, where all they have to do is be better than their alternative, which is nothing at all. So the early personal computers got their start among hobbyists and toys for children, people who literally couldn't afford a $2 million mainframe machine, and they were delighted with something that, yes, it was clunky, it wasn't that great, but it was better than their alternative, nothing at all. And then the other hallmark of disruptive innovation is that, powered by technology, it gets better year over year over year, such that what at one point is a primitive innovation becomes good enough to do complicated tasks and procedures and processes, and people in those inner circles, they rapidly migrate out to the disruptive innovation as they're delighted by a product or service that's far more affordable, convenient, accessible, simple, and is good enough for what they need. True, it's still not as good as the most cutting-edge products and services inside that innermost circle, but it's good enough for what the majority of them need. Even today, there's obviously people who still use mainframe computers and probably won't ever stop. They need all that performance, but the majority of us have moved out to machines that are accessible and affordable and plenty good enough for us. And we've seen this disruptive innovation continue with laptops and then handheld phones. Indeed, you can tell this story in sector after sector of how disruptive innovation has transformed it by replacing the dominant products and companies of the time with innovations that are far more affordable, accessible, and simple. They've even lifted whole economies, and so you can tell the story of, on that front line, of that top line, of how the American automakers, Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, were disrupted by the Japanese automakers, Toyota, Honda, and so forth. What's interesting is that Toyota didn't start at the high end with Lexuses. They started at the low end with crummy cars called Coronas. They rusted awfully quick. They weren't all that great, but for people that couldn't afford the gas-guzzling cars that Detroit was manufacturing, they were better than the alternative, nothing at all. And then they got better and better. From the Coronas, they went up market to the Tercels, and then the Corollas, Camrys, 4Runners, Avalons, and then the Lexus, and changed the world. Now, here's the other thing about disruptive innovation, which is from the perspective of Ford and General Motors, they saw these folks from Toyota coming. And every once in a while, they'd say, you know, we really ought to go out to that outer circle and compete with those buggers. So they'd send out a Pinto or a Chevette. But when they compared the margins of selling one of those vehicles with the ability to continue to go up market and push out another Ford Explorer or a Cadillac Escalade, it just made sense to make bigger products that they could charge more money for in the ways that they had historically made money. And so they ceded more and more ground to the Japanese automakers and Toyota, and by the early 2000s had fully become disrupted. And of course, bankruptcy and bailouts awaited them. And even today, what's interesting is that the American automakers make very few passenger cars. The vast majority of what they manufacture are SUVs, trucks, and things of that nature that are bigger and so forth, and they've ceded that market. Now, of course, it's not just the Japanese that have used disruptive innovation to power their economy through the likes of Toyota, Sony, Compaq, and the like, but Korea has played this game as well. Hyundai and Kia have been disrupting Toyota for the last many years. 15 years ago, people laughed at the quality in many cases of the Korean automobiles, and today Koreans win many of the quality awards and do so often more affordably. Samsung, LG, and so forth have lifted the Korean economy to unparalleled prosperity that Clay Christensen could only have dreamed about when he lived in Korea. And so we see this process play itself out. Now, the question, of course, is how does this relate to higher education? And to be candid, for a long time, disruptive innovation did not have any bearing on higher education. Indeed, if you looked at the innermost circle, and I'm just going to use the United States as an example here, you would have seen Harvard University perhaps, or Yale, MIT, places like that in the center circle. We then had decentralization, where the Land Grant Act started to create state-based universities like the University of Massachusetts that extended more access to students to be able to go to higher education who didn't have access before. But there was no technology enabler that allowed the University of Massachusetts to disrupt Harvard. They came in with a more affordable, more accessible offering that served and decentralized the industry, but it did not disrupt it. And then we saw community colleges further decentralize higher education, but not disrupt it. And it's only been in the last couple of decades that we've seen a technology enabler in online learning that has the potential to actually disrupt higher education and start to change the equation in some fundamental ways. And indeed, online learning in the United States is growing in line with that as institutions like Southern New Hampshire, like Western Governors University, have paired online learning with fundamentally disruptive business models that create lower priced, more accessible offerings that serve many, many more people. And by the way, are getting better and better and better year over year over year. And now, according to current statistics in the United States, roughly a third of students take at least one online course as part of their higher education or post-secondary studies. And a full 15% of students are fully online. If you look at graduate studies where disruptive innovation, I would argue, has been most apparent, roughly 30% of students are now, of master's students, are fully online, and we continue to see the disruption grow. Now, there's an interesting test just to understand if something is disruptive, and I put the 6 questions that all have to be true for there to really be something disruptive. But the first is the innovation targeting people who are non-consumers or who are overserved by the existing products and services? That is, all that the existing products or services that cost so much money, and they're offering things that ultimately I'm not willing to pay for, and I start looking for other options. The second thing is the innovation not as good as the existing services as judged by the historical measures of performance? So I would argue in the case of Southern New Hampshire University, for example, they are fundamentally redefining performance around questions of teaching and learning and placement into good jobs and economic mobility and things of that nature, as opposed to the traditional metrics of American higher education, which have been based around the quality of research, the selectivity of institutions, and things of that nature. The third question is the innovation simpler to use, more convenient, or more affordable? So this points to that you can't just be offering the new technology in the traditional model, as many institutions of higher education have done in the United States. They've gone online, but they've maintained the expensive price, selectivity, things of that nature, and not fundamentally offered something that's more convenient and affordable and accessible. The fourth one is there a technology enabler that, as I said, can carry the new value proposition up market? And I want to be clear here, as I see Southern New Hampshire University and Western Governors University and institutions like them in the United States that are offering more affordable, convenient, in some cases faster programs, I don't think they're going to disrupt a place like Harvard, because I think the other piece of disruptive innovation is that services that create quality by excluding people based on their exclusivity, based on their selectivity, based on becoming luxury products, they are disrupted. But I would argue that the massive institutions like regional comprehensive universities or small private liberal arts institutions in the United States that are not selective are at very grave risk. And so in the Korean context, for instance, Seoul National University or Yonsei or KAIST probably not at risk, but potentially in the longer run, and it's not an event, it's a process, you could imagine a lot of other institutions that cover and serve other students perhaps struggling to adapt to disruptive innovations that come in with far more affordable, convenient, and accessible offerings that get better and better year over year at serving a broader swath of students with more complicated challenges. The fifth question is this technology paired with a business model and innovation that allows it to be sustainable? And so in the United States and much of the world several years ago, there was a craze around MOOCs, massive open online courses. And I would submit those were not disruptive for a few reasons, one of which was they didn't have a business model innovation that allowed it to be sustainable over time because they were free. And then the last question is, are the existing providers actually motivated to ignore the new innovation and not threatened at the outset? And that's been clearly the case with many online offerings that are more affordable, convenient, and don't look or feel like traditional higher education. They often have different faculty models, different support structures for students and things of that nature that fundamentally reset the equation. Now, a big question, of course, is as COVID-19 has spread around the globe and shuttered the physical campuses for many universities around the world, and universities have had to go online, what's going to happen in the years ahead with this disruptive innovation? Even more to the point, frankly, I think mobile learning is emerging as a disruptive innovation below online learning. What's going to be the effect of this disease that has forced colleges and universities that did not want to go online? What's going to be the impact on this? And my sense is that two things are true simultaneously. On the one hand, I think because institutions that have been so resistant to online learning in their core operations are moving so rapidly without the support and structure and thoughtfulness and preparation for their faculty, a lot of students are going to be experiencing some very challenged, subpar, suboptimal experiences that are not great. And many faculty, I think, will be disgruntled and put off by these experiences. And so I'm actually, in the short term, think that this move might actually not be that great for online education's reputation because there will be a lot of bad experiences offered. At the same time, and particularly if this pandemic lasts longer and causes more social distancing or physical distancing for longer duration than perhaps we've seen to this point, in that it causes campuses not to have students come back maybe in the fall and so forth, then I think you could see many students start to say, well, if we're going to be online, why would I pay these high premium prices for a residential experience or a physical experience that I'm not getting? Why not look to a provider that actually knows how to do online learning well, has a lot of experience and expertise in it, and can do it more affordably and the like, and create a range of new experiences? And that it actually will fuel the growth of the native online providers that have set up business models to do this explicitly. They've carved out places to do online learning well and invest in it. And my sense is that the longer this stretches on, the more this advantages those providers and creates an advantage for them. The third thing that I think is also true is that institutions are now going to have to take online learning much more seriously as a disaster preparedness measure. In Singapore, if you look back over a decade ago when SARS and the avian flu and so forth occurred, they started to take some very strong measures to have online learning or e-learning weeks where students would stay home and not go to school and practice a disaster preparedness scenarios. I think all institutions are going to have to invest much more robustly in a variety of plans that contemplate both online scenarios as well as, frankly, offline scenarios in case of cyber security, hacking, and things of that nature that contemplate remote learning in a variety of ways to deal with potential interruptions in the years ahead, whether it's from pandemics, natural disasters, cybersecurity challenges, and the like. But they're going to have to take online learning much more seriously as part of that. And regardless of short-term faculty negative reaction to bad experiences, over time, I think they will invest more seriously, which will strengthen the online offerings and strengthen the technologies and research and development that is done in this sector, which I think will propel online learning to new heights and ultimately cause more disruptive innovation in higher education that will serve many, many more students in countries in a variety of circumstances when they're still employed through lifelong learning pathways and the like that help them step it up in their lives, extend themselves, and so forth in very fruitful ways. So that's an overview of disruptive innovation in higher education. Hopefully gives you a sense of what it is and what it isn't, how we start to see it playing out, and the potential for it to extend access and redefine what quality and value is in some very exciting ways that I hope are helpful. So thank you so much, and I'll turn it back to you.